Today we have something really special. Matt versus Japan. He's a YouTube sensation, not just in the Japanese world or Japanese language learning world, but now going way beyond that into learning in general and language learning. So thank you for being on our program or on my channel today, Matt.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Could you tell us just a bit about you, who you are, and what brought you into this area of language?
Yeah. Well, so I first got into learning Japanese, well over 10 years ago now. It was when I was a freshman in high school. And yeah, it was kind of just on a whim. I had never really been interested in languages historically. In fact, I was quite a bad student in the Spanish class that I was taking just because it was mandatory. But yeah, something about getting into anime and just hearing the sounds of the Japanese language and seeing the depictions of Japan in the anime, and I think also connecting it to how just all the shows that I loved as a kid when I was in elementary school, I later learned were imported from Japan. So all of this kind of just came together and just really, lit a spark in me that made me want to learn Japanese. And so, yeah, I've dedicated a pretty hefty chunk of time. Particularly, there was a 5-year period where I was pretty much just dedicating my life 24/7 to doing Japanese. 6 months of that I was living in Japan, but for the bulk of that period I was actually living in the United States, where I am right now, and just using media and technology, as well as Japanese people I was able to meet up with locally in order to create my own Japanese environment and use that to become fluent in Japanese.
One thing that really makes you stand out is, and we talk about it a lot here, through my channel over the years, I always use this word prosody. Prosody, and in relation to the natural rhythms of speaking a language, whether it's your mother tongue or whether it's a language that you're learning, it's all about prosody. And I've just found in the languages that I speak, and in this part of the world, I live, of course, in Asia, that prosody will always trump how you look. And so we focus on that. I think you, Dogen, as far as the Japanese, the foreigners speaking Japanese, are at the top of the game when it comes to prosody. When did you notice that your Japanese was taking a turn into this like natural sounding prosody? Like, was there a shift, or did you make a conscious effort to develop that kind of prosody?
Yeah, well, so actually, I got into pitch accent, which is probably one of the biggest aspects of prosody in Japanese, pretty late in the game. I was actually probably around 4 or 5 years into my intensive study period, where I realized there was something missing from my Japanese. And the way I kind of had this discovery was I went to some of my Japanese friends, and I was like, hey, if you just heard me speaking Japanese, what would you say was off about my Japanese? Or would you be able to tell that I wasn't a native speaker? Would you be able to tell that I was a foreigner just from my voice? And they said, yeah, I'd be able to tell. And so I was like, well, what is it that gives it away? And they said that the intonation was the thing that gave me away. Now, it took me a little bit of time to figure out that what they really meant by intonation. Well, it turns out what they really meant specifically was pitch accent, which is this aspect of Japanese prosody. That's technically a different thing from what's generally referred to as intonation, but Japanese people don't really make a distinction unless they're a linguist. They kind of just all throw it under the banner of intonation. But yeah, it's pitch accent, which I'm sure we'll probably get to talk more about. I found it was missing from my Japanese, and so I have a lot of theories on why it seems that most Westerners need to go out of their way to really study this in order to pick it up. I think it's just because it's something that is completely foreign to the English ear. We don't have anything like it in English. In English, changes in pitch never change lexical meaning. So I think the brain is not really naturally, until you kind of point it in the right direction, it's not really predisposed to be picking up on that level of information. And so I had to really go back and study pitch accent and train myself to hear it more than anything, because it was something I wasn't even really picking up on, and then rehaul my entire way of speaking, because I already had lots of bad habits related to speaking Japanese with the wrong pitch accent.
Wow, so much to unpack there with what you've said. Where do we start? I think the first thing, as far as pitch accent is concerned, now I've just done a webinar on pitch, accent, and tonal languages. So people who have never had any exposure to them or starting out, how should they sort of set themselves up to at least prepare themselves for tones and pitch accent? Now, I'm no expert on Japanese. I can read hiragana, katakana, and get by in Japan. As I was doing it, though, and I used some of Dogen's examples to say, this is how it is. And in listening back, I just hear some amazing things on Dogen's voice and things that he's doing in Japanese that are things that, even though I can hear, I really had to work at. So did you consciously start to have to model also like other things other than pitch accent? Like, can I give you an example? Have a listen to this.
Yeah.
I've by the way, so I've cut some of Dogen's samples out of his YouTube clip and sequenced them to my keyboard, my MIDI keyboard.
世界
Okay.
世界世界は
The one that I really noticed, have a listen to this.
日本
Could you say that word for me in Japanese?
日本
All
right, now listen to this next one.
弟
Can you say that?
弟
Try again.
弟
Okay, so things that both you and Dogen do, which myself, not as a non-Japanese speaker, didn't pick up on first until I listened to myself back. Have a listen to this, and you did it as well.
弟が
弟. He's got this glide in there. He's got nasalization. He's got all of these things happening. You can see the lips coming out. They're gliding down there. Did you consciously put that into your Japanese? Because you just did it as well. Also, have a listen to this.
弟日本世界は
Could you say that?
世界は
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
世界は
You listen to where that's coming from in the throat and in your throat. As a non-Japanese speaker, just hearing that, there's no way that I'd pick up on that first. So, I'm curious, did you pay conscious attention to that, or did that just develop over time naturally within you because you're doing it now?
I mean, I think the bulk of it was probably just through mimicry and through mass listening. Like, for the bulk of my period of learning Japanese, the thing I focused the most on was getting as much exposure as possible. So I would, have a separate MP3 player separate from my phone where I would load up Japanese audio, and I just put a headphone in whenever I had even just a few seconds. So I would really just try to get as much input as possible. And then when I would speak, I would kind of try to remember what it sounded like in my head when I had heard a native speaker say it. So this also goes beyond just pronunciation and accent, but my kind of philosophy was native speakers tend to express ideas in set patterns. And with when you're going from a language like English to a language like Japanese, and the distance is so large, you can't assume that anything is going to be expressed in a similar way as it is in your native language. So whenever I would go to express an idea, I would kind of ask myself, how have I heard Japanese people express this idea? And I would try to replicate that. So I was actually trying to very consciously not be creative, not try to make up or make guesses or make new constructions. I was trying to just copy what I'd already seen people doing. And I think that was kind of led to it. Because after a while, I had this, it's almost like I could replay the sound files in my mind of what it was supposed to sound like. And then when I would say it, if it was a little off, I could naturally kind of adjust it over time until it sounded right to me.
That's awesome. And that actually kills two birds with one stone. So you're both getting the phonology of it, but you're also getting how meanings are created. So you're saying, so the way that you develop that is mainly through listening. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, later on, and even more recently, I've been trying to continue to push my Japanese to the next level, and I've been doing more kind of work where I'm taking a native Japanese sentence and listening to that on repeat, and then recording myself and comparing the recording, kind of analyzing it, really like scrutinizing the differences. I think that doing work like that is necessary if you want to fully sound native, but my experience was you can get maybe 95% of the way there just through mass input and mimicry, but minus pitch accent. And the interesting thing about pitch accent is that there's an interesting relationship between pitch accent and intonation in Japanese, because intonation is the changes in the pitch contour of sentences as a whole that are often related to emotion, or for example, if we're asking a question versus making a statement, there's going to be different intonation patterns, even if the words in the sentence are the same. And so this is something that exists in every language, including English. So generally, what I've noticed is that when Westerners learn Japanese, they can pick up on the basics of Japanese intonation, but their brain kind of conflates pitch, accent, and intonation into one thing. So what happens in Japanese is that, let's say, for example, if you take verbs, there's two different pitch accent patterns that a verb can have. It's kind of this binary. And if you were going to take a verb and put it into the intonation pattern of asking a question, there's actually two patterns, one for each pitch accent pattern. So there's intonation pattern A that goes with pitch accent pattern A, and then there's intonation pattern B that goes with pitch accent pattern B for asking a question. And so what I've noticed is that even pretty high level Japanese speakers who come from Western languages, they'll, for example, they'll say verb A with intonation pattern and pitch accent pattern B. So they've picked up that there is this pattern that can be used for asking a question, and they'll use it right, but they don't realize that it's actually you have to use specific patterns with specific words. They'll use them interchangeably.
Could you give an example of just what this might sound like?
Yeah, so for example, they're just random first two verbs that pop into my head. So if you take the verb taberu, which means to eat, and then we also have the verb maybe yaru, or here's a more easier one, asobu, which means to play. So if I was gonna turn that into a question, meaning like, are you gonna eat? I'd say taberu. And so you can see the pitch accent pattern of taberu is low, high, low, taberu. And this pattern is maintained within the intonation pattern of the question. Like taberu, you can hear it. It follows the main contour and then goes up at the end. Whereas if I say asobu, that's low, high, high. It's the more flat pattern. And if I put that into a question, are you going to play or are you going to hang out? Asobu. So you can hear it maintains those patterns. So what I'll notice is that a Western Japanese speaker might say something like taberu or asobu, and they won't realize that actually those two patterns, you can't use them interchangeably. One pattern has to go with one word or the other.
That's brilliant. And that actually, we were covering in Minecraft the other week, tone languages and how music and singing handles these kinds of things. And I can say that, say for Thai or Chinese, melody lines actually follow pitch contour general shapes within the language that the songs were composed. And so, like, for example, the King's Anthem in Thai, Ka Wara Putta Chao, Ka Chao. They're these falling tones. So in the song, Ka Wara Putta Chao. So the actual tone is baked into the melody. Does that happen with pitch accent when Japanese is used in songs?
Not very consistently. There is a tendency, what I've noticed personally, that the pitch accent pattern will, especially for the more prominent words in the lines of a lyric, will maintain the pattern, but it's not too consistent. And I think maybe part of this is that I think the relationship between words and their pitch accent patterns is not quite as strong as the relationship between tones and their syllables in tonal languages. And one kind of example of one piece of evidence for this is that different dialects of Japanese have quite different pitch accent patterns. And there's even some the second most popular dialect of Japanese after what's considered standard Japanese, which is the Kansai dialect, actually has a pitch accent system where a lot of words are the opposite pitch accent. So where in Tokyo it would be high-low, in Kansai it would be low-high. And so because of this, maybe someone from the Kansai region would make a song, and to them the pitch accents are different. But people from Tokyo still, generally there's no trouble with mutual intelligibility. You can still understand them just fine. I think especially this has to do with the fact that in the case of these two dialects, people from Tokyo grow up hearing a lot of people from Kansai on TV, and people from Kansai grow up hearing even more people from Tokyo on TV. It's kind of like American English, British English, Australian English. We get exposed to each other's English over the course of our time growing up, so we get used to hearing it, even though it's pretty different.
I used to spend quite a bit of time in Kansai back in the 90s. I was a flight attendant. And so we'd spend time, we'd go into kicks into Osaka, but I'd know like, どこに行くねん? dokunikunen. They'd be very, very different. They were flipped. But what I find is that with pitch accents that they'll all be within this standard. It's when it starts going out of the standard, whether it's Tokyo Ben or Osaka Ben, then it sounds weird. And so if you're gonna be in one set, and I guess it's like tones in tonal languages, you might be able, like your tone. Somebody will say, "Oh yeah, but they say it like this in Phuket, or they say it like this in Chiang Mai, or they say it like this in Shanghai." Yeah, well then make sure that the whole tone set then is of Shanghai or Phuket. Otherwise, it's just going to sound wrong. Is that the same with pitch accents that you find?
Oh yeah. Yeah, 100%. Like Kansai dialect, like you just mentioned, it's not just the pitch accents that's different. They conjugate their verbs differently. They use different words for some of the most common words in the language. And so it's a whole set. It's a whole dialect, right? And so if you speak the whole dialect, then yeah, it's going to sound natural, assuming that you nail it, right? Because Japanese people from all over Japan are used to hearing the Kansai dialect. If you just like randomly have some words that are Kansai and the rest are all Tokyo style, then you're just going to sound foreign. And this is something, a big misconception, is that people think, oh, because pitch accent systems are different across Japan, I can speak pitch accent willy-nilly and it won't matter. And I mean, there's some truth to that in the sense that, yeah, you will be understood. They'll be able to understand you, although they might have to be paying more attention than they would otherwise, and they'll probably still have to clarify some things here or there. But you can get by. But the thing is, you're not going to sound like you're just some guy from Kansai if you're just speaking willy-nilly. You're just going to sound foreign because your pitch accent, first of all, it's not going to coincidentally align with Kansai most of the time. It's just going to be, you're going to say patterns that don't even exist a lot of the time. And also, yeah, just the inconsistency of it's just going to make it sound foreign more than anything.
Now, so this comes to a point, and I hear it a lot because people accuse me of trying to be too much of a perfectionist when it comes to pronunciation. A lot of people say, look, I just want to be able to speak to be understood. That's the main thing about language. For me, my argument is, at least in my life and in my work, the way that I speak the language has a profound effect on the way people interact with me. And so I don't want to be treated like an alien the whole time. My kids as well, they're native speakers, but the way they look could influence that. So I want to get closer to natural prosody. Also in my work, if I speak too foreign, people aren't going to open up to me. And so I need to go under the radar. So that's my excuse. What do you say to people when they say, oh yeah, but I don't want to actually have to perfect my pronunciation. I just want to be understood. Why did you shoot for native-like prosody?
Yeah, well, I mean, I understand that everyone has different goals, and I think that's completely valid. I don't think everyone should have to be a perfectionist, and there's definitely a trade-off between breadth and depth in a language. So if you're like me and you want to try to master one or two languages to the highest level you can, that means you're not going to be able to dabble in as many languages as you would otherwise. So there's a trade-off here. Other people have other hobbies. So I'm not trying to be prescriptive and tell everyone that they should do this, but just for me personally, I was always very passionate about Japanese. I always saw myself having Japanese be a big part of my life for the rest of my life, continuing to spend time reading Japanese books, watching Japanese shows, interacting with Japanese people. And I just knew that the stronger my Japanese ability was, then the better experience I would have when I'm engaging with the Japanese language. And that's just what I found to be the case. The more I improve my Japanese, then the more frictionless and easier it is to have meaningful communications with Japanese people. And so that's why I'm like, well, I'm going to keep spending time in Japanese, so why not keep trying to get better and better so that my experiences in Japanese just keep getting better and better. I also just enjoy it. For me, it's always fun to learn new things, to see my progress. I don't view it as this like hard Herculean task where I'm like suffering because of it. Like for me, I enjoy the whole process. So
I absolutely love your analogy for Refold. Just in a nutshell, could you tell the philosophy of what Refold is?
Yeah, well, so the analogy behind the name is the idea that learning a language as an adult, a new language, is kind of like, imagine you had an origami crane, or for the sake of this example, let's say you have a paper airplane and you unfold the paper airplane back into a normal piece of paper, and you use that same piece of paper to then go on to fold a crane. So when you're folding that crane, there's going to be creases that are already in the paper that are going to kind of function as this gravitational pull. They're going to pull you in the direction of your native language. And so you might have to work a little harder, be a little more attentive, or spend a little more time with the other language in order to overcome the tendency to do things in the old way and learn how to do it in the new way. But if you apply the technique correctly, then you can end up with a beautiful crane that's unaffected by the creases of what it used to be. That's the core idea behind it. But in terms of the actual method, I mean, it's pretty in line with what I've been explaining was my experience with the Japanese. It's very input based. It's very inspired by Stephen Krashen's philosophy. So actually to kind of, a lot of people think that I'm actually more aligned with Stephen Krashen than I really am. I'm really inspired by his core thesis of the input hypothesis, but I actually think it's a good idea to study the phonology of the language and the grammar and vocabulary of the language, especially initially when you're first starting, so that you can hit the ground running and take some advantage of your analytical mind when learning the language, so you're not just left kind of stuck in the same position as a baby where you have no clue what's going on. And so the first stage of Refold, there's 4 stages total, has to do with just building a foundation in grammar and vocabulary and the phonetics of the language. Then in stage 2, you're moving on to very input focused learning, where you're exposing yourself to as much input as you can in your target language, and you're still studying, but now your study is completely fused with your input. So you're looking words up as you go and making flashcards and a spaced repetition system to help you retain all the things that you come across in your input, and you work on that until you have really high comprehension. And then in stage 3, you start speaking the language and interacting with natives, and that takes you to a level of fluency. And then stage 4 is taking that basic fluency and trying to close the gap between you and a native. And so the part of the methodology that's a little bit unorthodox is that you really delay speaking the language. In stages 1 and 2, you're not worried about output. You're only worried about comprehension and input. And the reason for this is like we touched on, you're not going to know how to express things in a native-like way until you've actually heard natives say them. And understanding the language is a prerequisite for that. So because this is especially important for languages that are very different than your native language, if you want to speak in a native-like way, you have to have a period of just absorbing the language and learning how do people express themselves in this language. Because if you don't know that, you don't have any chance of being able to replicate that yourself.
Yeah, your Refold site is really great, and the people in my Minecraft community have been loving it, and they've been discussing your Refold site. What the site is Refold.la. Okay, Refold.la.
You can think of it as Refold languages.
Okay, there you go. So Refold.la, go and check it out, because we've been talking about it and people are actually loving it. And it's curious. I think we've come to similar conclusions. I agree. Like, input is everything in hearing how people say it. What I would say for my personal thing, now Stephen Krashen is speaking tonight with Judith at the Polyglot Conference. They're actually doing a panel discussion. And so one of my Minecraft guys, Luke, I hope that he'll be able to pitch the question or just ask this, because I really respect Stephen Krashen from what he's done and all his work over there. What I've noticed with myself, though, is that my ear and my intimate knowledge of phonology and how I can hear sounds, how I can hear what I'm not doing, just like listening to Dogen then, and my knowledge of how to shift sounds allows me then to actively listen and then correct things that if I hadn't have known, I wouldn't have even picked up on the first place, because they would have just been filtered out. Now, I've heard some Japanese speakers who have been speaking Japanese for maybe 30 years, and so they're exposed to Japanese every day of their life, native Japanese, yet many of these pitch patterns have gone by the wayside, or they haven't even been picked up on. Where do you stand as far as, amount of input or actively working with phonology or listening and trying to give some output to develop or to hone the way that you speak? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, well, what I've noticed is that, like you point out, among the people who don't actively put a lot of work into studying the language and they kind of just leave it up to input and stuff to happen naturally, there's a really big range of results that people end up with. Some people end up with a near native-like ability, other people don't. And so I've always been really curious about this question: what causes this disparity in results? And the biggest thing that I've noticed is that it has to do with how assimilated the person becomes in the culture, more than anything else. So for example, I interviewed someone on my channel a couple months ago named Nick. He's a professional singer in Japan. And for the last 10 years, he's been living his entire life in Japanese. He apparently has no foreign friends. He only interacts with Japanese people. And he's one of the most Japanese-feeling people I've ever met. Not just in his language, in his mannerisms, in the way, just his body language, everything. He feels like a Japanese person. And he's one of the most proficient foreign language Japanese speakers I've ever heard. And so I think the fact that he's so assimilated into Japanese culture really gets his unconscious mind to analyze the language for him in a way, because he views the Japanese people as his in-group, and because of that, he wants to fit in on a subconscious level, and part of that is sounding like they sound. Whereas there's a lot of people who they get good at Japanese, but they still think of themselves as an American or, a British person. They don't think of themselves as Japanese. And so I think their mind kind of at a certain point says, okay, I'm good enough at Japanese now, and they stop moving closer to the native speaker. So one aspect of this is if you want to sound good, try to assimilate, try to align your identity with the target culture, and I think that's going to allow you to take most advantage of your subconscious mind. But the other side of this is that I think an analogy I've been thinking of for this very question is kind of mental health. So when you think about your mental health, there's two different ways you can go about improving your mental health. One is you can focus on physiology, and one is you can focus on psychology. So on physiology, if you start exercising more, you clean up your diet, you maybe even take some kind of supplements or some other medication that changes your brain chemistry, that's going to have a really big impact on your mental health, right? Not necessarily positive if you're not doing it correctly, but it can be very positive. There's also the psychological route, right? You can get therapy to work through any past traumas that you have. You can practice meditation and positive psychology, and you can completely change the way that your mental health is through doing that kind of internal work. So there's kind of these two sides of the coin of mental health. And I would say if you want to be as mentally healthy as possible, do both, right? There's no reason to pick one or the other. So I think when we're talking about language learning, one half of this coin, maybe the one that we would say is psychology, is that assimilation I'm talking about, aligning your identity, trying to make your subconscious mind do as much work for you as it can. And then the physiology side would be you're actually looking at the sounds consciously, analytically. You're training your mouth and your ears, and you're doing it that actively. So if you want to have the best possible shot at sounding like a native, I would approach the problem from both of these two angles.
Yeah, that's so true. It's physiological and it's also a mental issue. One last question, because time flies. Pitch accent has not traditionally been one of the things that is taught when beginners go into Japanese. And I haven't seen it in many books. And I've heard some people say, oh, yeah, just learn it later on. Why? But say you're in tonal languages, it's one of the first things you have to learn because tones are a fundamental part of the language. Why do you think pitch accent has been almost this vestigial thing for Japanese learning? Is it just because Westerners haven't seen importance for it? Or I'm trying to get this, and do you see it changing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't have the answer, but the biggest thing I feel is that it's definitely arbitrary. It's kind of like, how in linguistics, the distinction between what is a dialect versus what is a language has more to do with politics than the reality of the language. I feel like it's the same thing, where it's not that pitch accent is actually less important than tones per se. It has to do with some arbitrary combination of facts about the teaching industry and other happenstance historical stuff. But actually, if you look at older Japanese textbooks from the 80s and early 90s, a lot of them actually do teach pitch accent at least a lot more than today. So it's not that pitch accent was always neglected. It's come to be more neglected. And I'm not sure what caused that. I think it might have to do something with maybe the Japanese education industry trying to make Japanese easier, because people were feeling that it was difficult and they were like looking at what else can we shave off so that people don't get overwhelmed. But I mean, that's kind of my hypothesis. I'm not really sure, but either way, I think it's definitely changing. There's much more talk about pitch accent, much more recognition for the importance of pitch accent, and so I definitely think going forward into the future, it's going to become completely standard, because my experience was going back and fixing my pitch accent after I already had lots of bad habits was a nightmare, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. I think you're going to be a lot better off if you can build good habits the first time.
Yeah, it's much harder to unlearn. I hear a lot of Westerners coming in to learn Chinese and Thai and Vietnamese, and they say, oh, it's okay, just have a go, just say it. You don't have to get the tones and everything. People understand you. And And when you actually speak to the locals, they have a very different opinion. They might sort of nod and everything and say, no, they're important. And I speak to actually Thai teachers and they're saying, look, can you get this message through to students that tones actually are important? You can't just wing it. You actually need to get them right, and they're going to have a real effect on to whether somebody's going to understand what you're saying or not. It's almost like somebody patting themselves on the back saying, oh, I don't really need to do this. So I see that in tonal languages, but I can only assume. I'm not really in the Japanese learning community. I would love to be. Maybe I will in the future. But I imagine maybe it's something similar that Westerners maybe haven't seen the importance as much as actually the effect that it really does have with native speakers.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is probably that the intelligibility is not as much of an issue with tonal languages. Like, I hear for tonal languages people saying, like, I spoke perfect Chinese and he pretended to not understand me, but in reality, he just messed up the tones or something else, or his vowels or something, and he wasn't intelligible. That is not as much of a problem in Japanese, just due to the nature of the phonology. You can speak with bad pitch accent and they will understand you in most cases. There's not that many words that are minimal pair differences with the pitch, and even for those words you can generally tell by the context. So it's people basically can be completely oblivious to how they sound. The thing is, once you can hear pitch accent, when you hear foreigners speaking with messed up pitch accent, it's very jarring and not pleasant to listen to at all. But if you don't hear pitch accent, you don't hear it, right? It's like a frequency your brain doesn't tune into. So there's people who, they're just like, Japanese people understand me. Japanese people praise me all the time, which is something I know you've talked about, right? When you're at this kind of like, okay, pretty good, but not native-like level, you get a lot of praise. When you're actually at a native-like level, you don't get a lot of praise. And so because they're getting a lot of praise, they're being understood, they're like, well, clearly nothing must be wrong with my Japanese because everything is going great for me. And it's only once you learn how to hear it that you start realizing, oof, I didn't realize I sounded like that, or I never would have been okay with that. You know, it's kind of this blissful ignorance.
I think it would be like that if I was speaking like this. I'm actually speaking with an Australian accent, but my pitch and intonation is all over the place. And just listening to that for even like 20 seconds would be frustrating. Even though I'm using an Australian accent over the words, the pitch and the intonation is totally off. So I think that maybe that's an exaggerated simulation, but it's I get it. It's the same with tonal languages. Okay, we need to wrap this up. I just maybe rapid fire questions. Any other languages on the cards?
I am interested in Chinese and Korean. I actually haven't talked about this too much, but actually I was learning Chinese for a while. And I was taking a similar approach that I did to Japanese, which involved a lot of reading. But I've started to think more that I want to try to experiment with learning through listening. And so I actually put that on Chinese on pause. I've been doing a lot of study of phonetics and things like this right now. And so I think I might in a couple months want to try to reapproach it from a new lens of seeing how far I can go just with my.
Brilliant. Well, if you any questions or you want to reach out to, feel free. I'd love to see how you run with things like Chinese, especially because you've got the kanji already, and shifting those. That's my downfall with Japanese, because I know my kanji from Chinese, and I also know like Middle Chinese pronunciations in different dialects. It's easy to look at, say, the Korean hanja or the Japanese kanji and know the onyomi, so the Chinese pronunciation, but the kunyomi always gets me, which means that I can read and understand stuff. When it comes to come out, it just stops. But I think you could go the other way around, because you've got all the different pronunciations for the kanji. You just have to filter it many to less, which it may be an easier thing for you into Chinese.
Yeah, what I found when I was dabbling with Chinese is that reading was very easy, and when I would watch things with subtitles, I could kind of hear a lot of similarities. But when I turned the subtitles off, it was so fast and so blurred, I was totally lost. So I think Chinese listening and training your ears, because there's with the smaller number of syllables, possible syllables, and the tones, it's listening is I think harder, but reading is probably a lot easier in Chinese compared to Japanese.
So just finishing this off then, Matt, any final words and how can people get in contact with you and your work? Yeah,
well, super fun to talk about all these. They're all my favorite topics. My YouTube channel, like you mentioned at the beginning, Matt vs. Japan. You can also find me on Twitter at Matt vs. Japan. I've been pretty active recently. And also, yeah, Refold is my website, refold.la. We also have a Patreon with exclusive content that you can check out if you want to learn more. We also have a free community, by the way, on Discord as well, that you can join through the Refold website.
So once you've joined the Minecraft Discord server, then you'll have it up there, and you can also join Matt's as well. And of course, you're always welcome in there, and we love your input. I've seen you in there recently.
Thanks so much.
And you've got a big fan base with the people who follow in our Discord community. So that's fantastic. And between you, Dogen, stuff that I'm doing, stuff like Mike at Glossica, I hope that we're going to start to, shift into a new area of what we can do with language and sound and the way people speak languages, the levels that they look to achieve. I think we said on the phone the other day, or you said it, if you can set the gold standard is native prosody and you can make it easier to attain, then why not? I totally agree with that. And if you're going to be putting up just as much effort to get something closer to native standard than what you would otherwise, well, I want to go for the native-like stuff. And that's what you're doing. That's what Dogen's doing, and a bunch of other people. So hopefully we can see some shifts over the years to come.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're already seeing it starting to happen.
Yeah. Okay, so there you go. Matt versus Japan. Check out refold.la and also Matt versus Japan YouTube channel. And I'll see you on the other side.